Hi, I'm Pastor Bob Thompson at Corinth Reformed Church, and I'm going to invite you to take a trip with me, a journey. It'll start in the past, it's going to bring us right up into the present, and it's going to take us into the future. And the one constant in the whole story is God. He's always been there through the various stages of the journey. He has worked in and through the members of this church. So come on and join me. Let's take a trip together. Stay tuned. As we begin this journey, I want you to think about the Hickory that you live in, and then I want you to go back a long time before that. When no buildings were here, when no bridges were here, when there was just trees and valleys and mountains and Indians, and a few white settlers started to come, but where did they come from? They had come about a couple of hundred years earlier from Germany, and they were Reformed people, and that means they weren't Catholic and they weren't Lutheran. But a lot of those people in the early days after the Reformation were fighting each other, like there were constant wars. And in Germany, there was a war that lasted for 30 years. Can you imagine trying to be a farmer in a place where the war's going on, not just one season, but two, but 30 years? So what do you do after all those years of war? They took the risk of crossing the Atlantic Ocean. The primary place where they came was Pennsylvania.
One common thread I've learned about Hickory and Davidson County is they're both largely settled by German immigrants. They all had the same story. They came to port in Philadelphia, came down the Great Wagon Road as they ran out of land in Pennsylvania, and settled in Davidson County around Salisbury, that area.
When Pennsylvania became too crowded, they had to come south. So they came into the fertile river valleys of North Carolina, the Haw River and the Yadkin River and the Catawba River. But when they got to the Catawba River, they couldn't even get across the river. Imagine no bridges. And the area was dominated by Indians. There were Cherokee Indians and there were Catawba Indians, and honestly, they didn't like each other. It turns out that the Cherokee Indians were far more fierce and warlike and distrustful of the whites than the Catawba Indians were. So as time went on, the white settlers had to figure out, okay, we can trust the Catawba Indians, but not the Cherokee Indians. Heinrich Widener was one of the first settlers of this area. This is back in the 18th century.
Hi, I'm Alfred Robinson. This is a family cemetery. It's been here since the 1700s. Heinrich Widener was one of the original settlers in Catawba County. There were others around about the same time. This is his gravestone, and he changed his name to Henry Whitener, but his original name was Widener, Heinrich Widener.
And he first ran away from home, then he came back, he had his family here. And after a while, he got chased into South Carolina. But when he would want to come back, he learned that there was one particular tree that was marked by the Catawba Indians.
The Catawba Indians were friendly, and the Cherokee Indians would get on the warpath sometimes. And they painted a red ring on the oak tree over here. And Henry and his wife and some of the children went to South Carolina for about 2 years. There was a lot of Indian fighting going on up here.
And he knew whether it was painted red or not, if it was safe to come back into Catawba County. So now you can imagine as time goes on, white settlers continue to come here, mostly Reformed and Lutheran, German people. When they got here, they didn't have homes. They had to build their own out of logs. They had to do their own surveying to figure out where they would live. And they constantly had to be on the guard against the environment around them as well as against the Native Americans. So eventually they learned to cooperate with some of those Indians, and they built their homes, and Catawba County became a peaceful place. But it was a peaceful place to grow a farm. It wasn't until 1860 that the first railroad actually connected across the Catawba River into what you know of as Hickory. And that allowed us then to begin to build industry. the farmers had somewhere to sell their products. They could put them on a train and ship them out. Hickory was first known as Hickory Tavern because honestly all that was in the center of the city was a bar at the railroad. And it was just a shack. So at that shack, the trains would stop, people would get out or get on the train, they'd load up the wares and they'd ship them out. And then before long, homes started to build up closer to the railroad depot. There were a number of different German Reformed families there at that time, and they decided they wanted a church. Before they could build a church, they started with a school. Corinth can trace Hickory's first school to our own heritage. It was called the Free Academy. And they invited Dr. Jeremiah Ingold, who was a powerful preacher known across western North Carolina, a powerful man of God who knew how to preach the word, but also knew how valuable education is for every kid growing up.
My great-grandfather who founded the church, Jeremiah Ingold, the first minister, died long before I was born. So I did, of course, I got to know my grandmother really well, who was his daughter. And she died in 42 and I was born in 32. So I remember her because of, she read to me a lot. And I really appreciated that.
Let me tell you about Jeremiah Ingold. He was a missionary to Hickory. You may not think of Hickory as a mission field, but it was. This was a frontier town. There was lawlessness here. The organization of government and sheriffs and all was not here yet. So Jeremiah Ingold comes to a town where there are a handful of believers in the Reformed faith, and he realizes this place needs help. But think about this. It was before, during, and after the Civil War in the 1860s. People were sending their young men off to war. They couldn't work the fields. And when the war was over, you had devastation of crops. You had families that had lost their loved ones. And furthermore, you had absolutely no money. The Confederates had invented their own money, and after the war, it was useless. In this environment where people were so poor, they would take logs, connect them, and put a little roof over them out of more logs, and then put branches and leaves on top, simply for shelter in the summertime. That was where this church got started, in what's called a brush arbor. In the wintertime, of course, it was a little bit too cold for that, and so they would meet at the home of Dr. and Mrs. Henry Link. So now we have Jeremiah Ingold wanting to start a church in Hickory Tavern, and he has nothing to go with except for a handful of people who have land but no money to do anything with. I don't know what you picture when you think about people in 1860s worshiping, but let me tell you, first of all, there were only 22 of them that organized Corinth Church, plus of course their kids. This was not a large brush arbor. Furthermore, Jeremiah Ingold wasn't even a full-time pastor. He was what was known as an itinerant pastor. That meant that he had several other churches that he had care for, and he might come to Hickory only once every several weeks. So pretty quickly, the Reformed Church in North Carolina sent appeals out to the rest of North Carolina and even all over America to say, could you help this poor town that's our mission field get a church started? Could you help them build their very first church? When we're talking about the church they built, we're talking about a clapboard building that looks just like old St. Paul's over near Newton. The first sanctuary was built by Corinth in 1871 on Shuford Avenue behind Union Square. Other denominations also shared the facility. It was 33 feet wide, 56 feet long, and had 3 rooms on the first floor that was used for Sunday school. The second floor was the sanctuary. And here's Jeremiah Ingold gathering with these people to start Hickory's first church. So these were German people who had brought with them their German Bibles and catechisms and hymnals. They were not so concerned about spreading their faith as they were preserving their faith. They didn't want to lose what they had in the homeland. Jeremiah Ingold, however, had a somewhat different approach. The Second Great Awakening had swept across the South, and not just Baptists and Methodists, but Presbyterians and Reformed and Episcopalians were all affected by this fever pitch of revival. So what happened with Jeremiah Ingold, he was a passionate defender of Sunday schools and prayer meetings and revival meetings. Jeremiah Ingold is described as one of God's great servants in the history of the Reformed Church. He was legendary at that time, almost the Billy Graham of North Carolina. And when people in Hickory Tavern wanted to get a pastor, they go, "We're going after Jeremiah Ingold because he's the best we can find in this area." He literally had to go in a horse-drawn buggy from one community to another. Don't think about him hopping in a car, right? Or even getting on a train. But here was a guy who just loved Jesus, and he wanted this faith to be strong as Western North Carolina developed. If you're thinking about North Carolina before the Civil War, you may remember that there were slaves here. Now we think of, because of the movies, we think of slaves as always being beaten and mistreated, and candidly the fact that they were slaves is bad enough. It's just wrong. But there were masters that treated their slaves kindly. In fact, after the war, some slaves wanted to stay with their masters and continue to work for them. But there was this great division, and after the Civil War, it was a huge problem that we have all these people now who used to be slaves. Now they're not owned by anybody. Where do they live? What do they do? Let me give you a glimpse into who Jeremiah Ingold was. He was the president of the North Carolina classis of the Reformed churches. That means he had stature and respect all across North Carolina among these churches. In that role, immediately after the Civil War, months after the Civil War, Jeremiah Ingold drafted and sent a letter to all of the Reformed churches in North Carolina. And this is what he said about the people who had been freed. He said, God requires us now to respect them. It was the providence of God that we lost this war. And slavery has now been blotted from our state. And he said, what does God require of us in respect to them? It's now demanded of us all to ask that every facility should be afforded them to settle in families so that they will have a home. Secondly, he said that they be afforded employment at good wages so that they can live honestly and provide for their families. Third, that every aid and encouragement be given to them to educate themselves and their children. And fourth, that means of religious instruction and worship be provided for them. He wanted all people, no matter the color of their skin, to be industrious, quiet, and useful. That's what we do as believers. So here's already a man who has been the missionary to Hickory that now wants to extend this missionary spirit to people who have not been given the advantages that he and the other white people had been given in North Carolina. So now you have these 22 people, 22 adults gathering together on May the 22nd of 1869 saying, we're going to be a church. And it was Dr. Jeremiah Ingold for education and ministry that made this happen. I'm fascinated by the fact that he wasn't just interested in people's spiritual lives, but for their economic lives as well. And the biggest problem in the middle part of the 19th century in frontier America was alcoholism. So Dr. Jeremiah Ingold was a pioneer in North Carolina on what became the Prohibition movement to eliminate all the manufacture and sales of alcohol in America. So here's a man that had a powerful impact. He was a great man who first of all loved God. He was a family man. He was a traveling man. He was willing to go to new places, new frontiers. He was the first missionary who came and organized what God was doing here in Hickory, North Carolina. And we still today benefit from his vision and leadership and impact. After 5 years at Corinth, it was time for Dr. Ingold to move on.